Well, Pat, as Christians, we want to say that morality is in some way based or grounded in God, that God is the source of moral truths and moral obligations. So today, I'd like to explore this idea with you. I'd like to think deeply and carefully about how it is that morality is based in, or that morality bottoms out in God. Now, in my experience, when lay Christians who are not professional theologians and philosophers think about God's relation to morality, they tend to think about it in terms of God's power and God's authority to issue commands to us. In other words, morality is based in God because he's all powerful and sovereign. God's the creator of the universe, and therefore he's the supreme judge, he's the lawgiver. It's God's house, God's rules kind of thing. So as creator, God has the divine right to issue commands, and as creatures, we're under an obligation to obey them. So what is good and moral, and then what is evil and immoral, is ultimately based on God's commands. And this was basically my understanding of God's relation to morality for a long time growing up in the church.
Yeah, call that grumpy old dad metaphysics, right? My house, my rules. Yeah.
And I think this is, and I think it's a natural way to think about the question. I mean, after all, we're familiar with the idea of being under the power and authority of others. As adolescents, we're subject to the authority of our parents and our teachers. We understand that they exercise a certain right over us. They make the rules. They demand our obedience. And then even as adults, we live in societies with governments that have power and authority to determine and to enforce laws. So it's, again, natural to think that morality is related to God in the same way, that God has authority to set the rules. However he sees fit, and then he has the power, right, to enforce them. Now, this is certainly true as far as it goes, right?
Yeah, can I say something right there? Because that's really interesting, is that even if grumpy old dad doesn't give you good reasons for why, his authority is binding, I think most of us realize that there is a legitimate authority that grumpy old dad has over us, right? It could be poorly exercised and it could become illegitimate, and then I would say it's no longer authority, it's just power at that point, right? But I just want to emphasize what you're saying is right, that we naturally recognize that there is a thing as legitimate authority. Parents are prime examples, but the state, various institutions, teachers, and so on. So I'm sort of taking that as data, right? Yeah. And I want to know, is there a story we can tell to make sense of this that could actually ground this, even if grumpy old dad can't tell me the right story, right? Is there something that still gives grumpy old dad the authority that I generally should do what he says, right, within certain bounds? So anyways, it was a good point you're making. I just want to draw it out a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to reemphasize that this is a natural way to think, and in some senses a biblical way to think, and I think it's a good place to start when we're thinking about the question of God and morality. And it's certainly true that God's all-powerful and has the right to make the laws and to enforce them, so it's true as far as it goes. But later in my own life, as I began to think philosophically about the question, I came to realize that this view of God's relation to morality doesn't go far enough, that we can't ultimately ground moral truths on God's authority and power alone. Right. So Pat, help us understand the problem here of reducing morality to divine fiat and divine commands.
Right, yeah. So a lot here, and I'm excited to explore this with you, Anthony. But I think right off the bat that people are a little suspicious of this account because there's this sort of general intuition that might doesn't make right, right? Just because you're powerful, just because you're mighty, just because you could, do something to me that I wouldn't like, that alone seems insufficient to sort of ground a legitimate authority. And we know, like, grumpy old dad's a good example, right? Even if we feel that he has authority over us, we wouldn't say it's in virtue of the fact that he's just bigger than us or could make our lives miserable. True, grumpy old dad may very well be able to make our lives miserable, but like, no way is that like what actually grounds the authority if it's there. There has to be something else. If there isn't something else, then I would begin to question the entire enterprise. Of course, this goes right back to the Republic, right? This is the Republic deals with questions of authority, and justice, and might making right, and all that. And of course, this is something is rejected, not just by I think Christians should reject it. Actually, not all Christians reject it. We'll get into that, right? But it's rejected by classical philosophers as well who thought about this. So I think that this is sort of segueing, speaking of Plato, into another famous, dilemma, if you will, or moral issue that is now presented against God as the ground of morality or axiology, and we can distinguish those two later. But it was originally presented against polytheism, not monotheism, and this is the famous Euthyphro dilemma coming from one of Plato's dialogues. And in its more contemporary form, in the monotheistic version, it essentially says this: does God will something because it is good, or is something good because God wills it? And this is meant to push the theist into an uncomfortable position, because neither option there is particularly attractive, at least according to what we might say are some relatively strong pre-theoretical moral intuitions, right? Or theological commitments, right? So on the one hand, if God wills something because it's good, on the surface it seems like there might be something like above God that has authority over God, to which God needs to consider or consult
an independent standard,
or be informed by, right, to issue his decrees. So in that sense, maybe God is a sort of reliable moral informant. Maybe he has a certain epistemic access to some realm of moral facts that exists independently of him, right? So this is a harm, we might say, to commitments of divine ultimacy, maybe divine aseity, something like that.
Yeah,
right?
and we'll look at that one in a minute, because I think that the next maybe natural progression in a person's thinking about the way that morality relates to God actually might get them impaled on that horn of the dilemma. So I actually want to look at that after we talk about this first horn related to the idea that what is good and moral is simply based on God's will,
and that's
God's
right.
commands.
And that is the other horn. So call that first one the independence horn, right? There's something independent of God, and that's generally in tension with commitments that Christians hold, like divine ultimacy and so on and so forth. But this other horn, I think, is in a sense more troubling. At least it's more troubling to what I would say is the moral data, right? That something is good just because God willed it, and call this the arbitrariness horn, right? Because it would seem to make morality arbitrary. Could God have just willed that rape was good, and suddenly that would have been, and most of us say that just seems totally absurd. Yeah. And let me just pause right here, because I think there is an operative assumption, it's certainly in our background. I think it could be defended, but I'm not going to defend it here, of what we might call as a robust form of moral realism. So just for your audience, philosophers kind of divide on the question of morality between realists and anti-realists. And the names are very clever, because if you're a realist, you think that morality is in some sense real, right? That what seems to be the case in some sense actually is the case. We need to just kind of figure out a story that makes it intelligible. Whereas anti-realists want to say, no, there's what seems like, even if you think that there's this sort of objective binding, web of moral laws and rules, you're kind of just deluded, right? Morality is really, it's entirely reducible to fancy or opinion, or your whims, your desires, your subjective tastes, and it's and then they'll usually tell a story about how morality is simply an evolutionary device that's useful for avoiding bears and procreating, something like that. Right? So I'm assuming that we're not anti-realists, right? That we're working with moral realism. And I think I want to say generally that, there's some really strong intuitions here. And I think for this kind of work, we can take those intuitions as generally reliable, if not infallible. And if we can find a story that can make sense of what the moral data is, then other things equal, I think that's reason to prefer that story, right? That's what I want to say. And the moral data isn't, let me be clear on what I think the moral data is, because this will relate to this horn. There's actually lots in our moral experience, right? One is that moral facts are what we might call stance independent, and that's really just to say that I am not an infallible judge of what is good for me, right? Something isn't good for me just because I desire it, right? Something could be really good for me even if I don't desire it, and something could be really not good for me even if I do desire it, right? So there's something, right, that is sourcing or grounding certain moral facts. It is not just my desires or my preferences.
It seems like the philosophical parlance of late has shifted away from the idea of objective moral values and duties into stance-independent moral values and duties. Is that right? It seems like there's been a shift in the...
I think so, because one can say that it's still... that there's still objective, and this is just kind of like, I think, philosophical silliness, but I guess there are distinctions that make a little bit of a difference. Well, they'll say, well, it's still, an objective moral fact that this thing is good for you, Anthony, but it's just an objective fact about your subjective state. Right? You see what I'm saying? Yeah. And it's like, so like laugh, haha, this is silliness. So to get around those sorts of things and others, then we move to stance, just to say that it's stance independent.
Okay,
but
good.
I'm still fine using the term objective because I think most people know what we're going for there.
Yeah.
Plato wants to go further. He wants to go for universality too, and say that there could be nothing that is like good for me that is also bad for you, Anthony. Right? And I think that's actually right. I think that we want a story that could ground that. That's for another conversation. Another important one, though, and this relates to the arbitrariness horn, is what we might call the data of moral constraint. And this is the idea that moral facts couldn't have been all over the place, right? There's no possible world where rape would have been a good thing, right?
Yeah.
So there's got to be substantive constraints on what what the sorts of moral facts that there are, right? So we need a story that sets constraints in place, right? And again, I think this is a basic intuition. We think that there's just something about the nature of certain things that is like, no, that could never be good. So it's more than stance independent in a moral. And then I think a robust form of moral realism should also tell a story about how we have good success, alithic and epistemic success, about we have lots of true moral beliefs and we're justified in those moral beliefs, right? So there's a lot here to moral realism that we want to be able to tell a story about. And of course, I'm going to say that I think classical theism can tell a very good story there.
If I could just interject, I'd say I'd go a little bit stronger than that. I know it's all the rage today, talk about seemings and intuition, moral seemings and moral intuitions, but I kind of agree with Aquinas on this, that we actually have knowledge of moral principles.
Yeah.
I would actually call it knowledge of these principles. Maybe we don't have full knowledge of everything that the principles imply. That has to be worked out and reasoned. But Aquinas thought, just as we have first principles of knowledge when it comes to theoretical reasoning, so for example, the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, and so forth, so we have first principles of practical reasoning or prudence, which he called synderesis. And so I tend to be even stronger on that. I don't like seemings and intuitions. I actually think we have knowledge of principles here when it comes to what is good.
Yeah, I agree. I think Aquinas was right. I think you're right on that. As you know, his principles are extremely broad, so it doesn't spell out a very detailed applied ethics for you.
That's right.
But I'll say, for the sake of what we're talking about today, you could be neutral on that. You could go with seemings or intuitions, and there's all sorts of various ways of understanding that. But yeah, I just wanted to just kind of flag what's in the background here, and I'm happy to say that all that we've got a robust form of moral realism that's in the background, and what we're doing now is we're searching around for a story about God specifically that can help us to make sense of this. And one of the issues with the Euthyphro dilemma is it would seem to, you could still maybe secure stance independence with the arbitrariness horn, right? It would still be an objective fact that this thing is good for you whether you desire it or not, but you would fail on moral constraint. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Because,
so tie it all back in. If something's right just because God has power, right? Clearly you're just getting impaled. You're just getting impaled on that horn, right?
Yeah. And goodness, morality just seems to be arbitrarily determined in that point. And so what is good could be bad. What is bad could be good, all based on God's will. So, all right, Pat, good. Let's see if we can push this further. So we have to ground morality then in more than just God's authority, power, and will, right? Now, some have suggested that what we need to do is to add something to this picture in order to fix it. So rather than simply focusing on the will of God as the ground of morality, we ought to focus also on the object of God's will. We need to say that God's commands are morally perfect. In other words, we don't have to worry about God's commands being utterly arbitrary, because what God wills is always in accordance with what is good. So God's will, unlike ours, is, let's say, morally impeccable, right? And his decrees are morally infallible. God's will is always in alignment with what is good. So what do we think about this, Pat? Can we fix the problem here in the relation between God and morality by the problem of grounding?
Yes.
By saying that God has a morally perfect will.
Yeah, so I think that this can help get away from the arbitrariness horn, but I think it seriously risks falling on the independence horn. And, for the reasons that we already teased before is, okay, well, maybe God's will is morally impeccable for some reason. I want a story about why that is. And oftentimes there is no story provided there, right? There's just a declaration that God is perfectly rational or omniscient. But I don't want a declaration. I want a metaphysics that spells that out, right? Like, what does it mean for God to be omniscient? How could a being be omniscient, right? But setting that aside, just granting it, it could just well be the case that there is, a number of more realists or moral Platonists, right? So they think that morality has something to do with some sort of abstract Platonic realm, right? So for all we know, God is perfectly rational, and he knows all the moral facts, and he's never going to issue moral decrees that goes against those facts. But that doesn't make God the source and standard of morality, right? If like this is really, God could just be the demiurge here, right? He's fashioning a world based on the forms, and sure, his decrees are reliable and they're constrained, but God is still in some sense looking to something. There's something, or at least there could be something, like you haven't closed off the option of there being, or you haven't shown that there isn't a need so far, we might say, for God to consider something beyond himself, in virtue of which he makes these accurate moral decrees, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah. So obviously, to grab hold of this horn, I mean, it seems to me that this is a direct threat to God's ultimacy. For anyone who believes that God is the sole ultimate reality, believes in divine aseity, that God exists through himself independently, the idea that there's an independent standard of goodness that exists somewhere out there, and that in willing, God somehow conforms to this standard of goodness so that all of his commands are good, seems problematic, right? I mean, I suppose there's probably some theists that are okay with it. I'm not sure Peter Van Inwagen might be okay with that. But if you are someone who holds to a strong view of divine ultimacy and aseity, this is a problem.
Yeah. So I think a lot of theists are not super attracted to that view for the reasons that you just said. I mean, I'll tell you, I'm not attracted to that view for several reasons. One, I think it's theoretically unnecessary. I don't think you need to go to Plato's heaven, right? I think it does pose a legitimate and concerning threat to God's ultimacy and aseity, and in such a way that it will sort of wind up making God in a complicated way kind of a brute fact himself. We can get into that later if we want, right? I think when you start to posit things alongside of God that are uncreated and eternal, it inevitably has consequences on your model of God, and then that model of God is no longer explanatorily ultimate. If that's the broad issue, missing many details, of course, right? And then, of course, I think at that point, it also gives the non-theists certain leverage where they can just say, do we really need God in this picture at all? If we're committed to a sort of Platonic realm, maybe our human reason is enough to just discern various moral truths and facts. Like, what's the need for this sort of demiurge intermediary? It doesn't seem like God is in a sense strictly necessary for moral, certainly not moral ontology anymore.
Perhaps for obligations,
maybe for something in obligation, but maybe we don't even need him for moral epistemology either. And those are two distinct things, right? Ontology considering the being of value and stuff like that, and then of course epistemology concerning how we come to form these beliefs and be justified in them and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, good. So I would say that the vast majority of deep thinking theists, especially Christian theists, are not going to be comfortable with this kind of account. Again, it falls afoul of the Euthyphro dilemma. Just to repeat that again, the first horn of the Euthyphro is something good because God commands it. We already looked at that. God, what is good, what is moral seems arbitrary if that's the case. Or the second horn is, does God command it because it is good? In other words, it seems that if what God commands, he commands because it's good, that there's this independently existing standard that is somehow coexistent, co-eternal with God outside of his sovereign controlled providence and so forth, and creative power. All right, good.
Yeah.
So we don't want to ground morality ultimately in God's will or commands, and neither do we want to ground morality ultimately in an independently existing standard of goodness to which God's will must conform. So both these options, as I said, succumb to the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, as many theologians know, theologians and philosophers, and as they have long insisted, the Euthyphro dilemma is actually a false dilemma because there is a third option here. Instead of grounding morality in God's will or in some independent standard apart from God's will, we can ground morality in God's nature, right? God's nature itself, some theologians and philosophers will tell us, is the standard of goodness. And since what God wills or commands is always in accordance with his nature, what he wills and commands will always be good. So there is a standard of goodness. Morality isn't just arbitrary. It's not arbitrarily determined by God's will, but the standard of goodness is God himself and not something external to him. So, Pat, as you know, a lot of Christian theologians and philosophers think that this move alone adequately resolves the issues of God's relation to morality, especially as it relates to the Euthyphro problem. So, Pat, do you think we've said enough? Do you think we're done here? Can we just wash our hands on this one and move on to the next problem?
No, I don't, and because I think you need a metaphysics, and I think you need a model of God that can actually secure this and make sense of it. I think it's generally the right strategy. I think that if you're a theist,
Agreed.
You better try to find a way to wedge between those horns. But the question is, what sort of theist can actually fit between the horns? That's the question. And I'm going to contend that I think probably only the classical theists can, right?
Yeah.
Notice
so
the upspeak on probably.
Yeah, let's flesh that out. So you've used the term complex theism.
Yeah.
And there are complex theists who make this move. So maybe just if you can define what a complex theist is, and then how they try to make this move and ultimately why you think it fails.
Okay, so I'm going to have to spill out a lot of background stuff here, I think, to just generally make my case or to give a story that I think is attractive and plausible. So I'll start with classical theists because it's a good way to draw out what a complex theist is. And a classical theist has all sorts of commitments that I think are really theoretically useful for this particular issue. And the reason that complex theists have an issue with this issue is because they typically deny these theoretical resources, right? So a classical theist, most controversially, is committed to the idea that God is absolutely simple, right? That God is not composed, right? There's nothing that God is sort of made up by, certainly not physical parts, but no constituents or properties or whatever, that God as a whole is somehow metaphysically downstream of or derivative from, right? God is not built up from anything. That's what a composite means. You're comprised of component parts, right? So this is a very controversial thesis because it means whatever we really intrinsically, predicate a God or attribute to God just is God, right? So classical theists, famously maintain that God just is God's nature, just is God's power, just is God's wisdom, just is God's goodness, and so on and so forth. And I've defended this claim as coherent in various places, essentially by trying to give a contemporary account of the doctrine of analogy, that when we make these attributions of God, we're not talking about power or wisdom in their common creaturely mode. Rather, we're talking about what might be called the limit case instance of each of these things. And very briefly, what I mean by that is best brought out through an illustration. So imagine different ordered series of things. Imagine polygons with increasing numbers of sides and angles, right? And what is that converging towards? Well, it's a circle, right? I think that's fairly obvious. And we would say that a circle is not a member of that ordered series. It's not an F, right? An ordered series of Fs. Yet undeniably, that's what the ordered series is converging towards, right? So we have something that has a real similarity, yet a categorical difference from its ordered series, right? Or take an ordered series of decreasing speeds converging upon a standstill, right? Standstill is not a speed, but definitely it's what that series is converging towards. So that's what a limit case idea is, versus what we might say is a limit simpliciter. A limited simpliciter is still itself a member of the ordered series, but might just be like as high as you can go, maybe the speed of light or something like that, right? So classical theists don't say that power and knowledge or whatever, as we commonly understand it, are identical. I mean, clearly, like a battery has power, but not knowledge. However, they will say there's good reason to think that whatever the limit case instance of power is identical with whatever the limit case instance of knowledge is, and so on and so forth. So this is just to show that this idea is not obviously incoherent. If a lot of smart people have thought about something for a long time that sounds obviously incoherent, they may have said a few more things about it, right, to make it make sense, right? And this is deeply
and let me
rooted.
just emphasize that this classical theistic view of divine simplicity reigned supreme throughout church history for the first 1700 years, with both Catholics and then later Protestants as well. So this is not a new-flung, outrageous theory that's come lately on the scene.
And not just Christian, right?
Right, yes. Muslims and Jews
deeply
too.
Pagan, Islam, Judaism, right? This is like the prevailing model of God, and I think for good reason, because it seems to be where reason converges when you're looking for the hunt for ultimate explanation, right?
Yes.
Okay, so what does this have to do with Euthyphro? Well, it obviously maintains that God doesn't have like goodness as a feature or a part. It also maintains that God isn't good by being made up of good or great making properties. And I think that sort of itself betrays complex theism, right? So complex theism just denies divine simplicity, right? They just that's the easiest way to understand and how they deny it, whether God is composed of tropes or property. There's all sorts of variants here, right? And this is a huge debate. We won't get into all the nuances, but broadly, that's the way it divides, right? Is they can't swallow divine simplicity, so they abandon it. And I think that's
so. God is so for the complex theist, God is a composite being of some sort.
Of some sort, right? And the way they often talk about God being the most good thing there isn't that God is identical to goodness. They might say it, but I don't think their metaphysics means it, right? And there's one thing to say something.
That's a good distinction.
It's another thing to mean it with your metaphysics, right? What they mean is God is like the limit simpliciter of power, knowledge, benevolence, and then all these things comprised together gives you the most good thing there is in the universe, right? And I think that's obviously getting impaled on the horn of independence, right? These things are already independently good, and they sort of conglomerate to make this thing that is, better than all the other things around, but not categorically different, not itself, as Plato would say, the form of the good. Classical theists are totally different. They actually maintain, and I think Plato is right about this, that if we're going to make sense of goodness, you can't have goodness come in at any part aside from the very beginning, right? Goodness had better be back of everything, right?
Fundamental.
It has to be fundamental. It has to be and I think Plato was spot on, right? Now there's questions and mysteries about that, but I think like that's for certain, right? If you try to have goodness like emerge or it's always going to be you're lost, right? So Plato maintained that the form of the good, the supercoordinate form of the good, is that in virtue of which all things are useful and beneficial and good and exist in the first place, right? And classical theists, and it's debatable how classical theist Plato was. If you read somebody like Lloyd Gerson, he's very classical theist. But setting Plato aside, classical theists hold on to that, I think, invaluable insight, and they just make the case that, this form of the good just is the God of classical theism, right? The form of the good just is the form of existence, given the classical convertibility thesis that goodness just is being under the aspect of perfection, desirability, so forth, right? So what this means in practical terms is that like the form of the good isn't good because it has so much power or knowledge or whatever. It's the form of the good is the paradigm from which things like power and knowledge and benevolence are just mere reflections or they're coming from the form of the good. The good is not being built up from them. Is that clear? Do we see, like, I think the pretty radical difference in these understandings and models of God, right?
For sure.
And so the classical theist is like most definitely and decidedly making God the ultimate wellspring, foundation and source of all axiology, right? And morality is just one part of that, right? Pertains to rational beings, contingent of self-determination, and so on and so forth, right? And as the form of the good that creates everything, I think the classical theist can tell a great metaphysical story that helps to make a lot of sense of all the moral data. I mean, one thing is classical theists have always had this idea of the divine ideas providing this sort of like blueprint for creation. And I think this is really useful for the data of moral constraint, because anything that exists has to have some sort of appropriate resemblance or fittingness to the good, right?
That's right.
And I think when you spell this out, in a sort of grand metaphysical or metaethical picture, what it means is that everything that exists only insofar as it somehow reflects, in however limited a way, goodness, right?
That's right.
It reflects goodness. And I think you can drive this even straight through Aristotle's theory, because Aristotle famously kind of equates goodness with function. Something is good insofar as it fulfills its proper function, and a knife is good insofar as it cuts well, or an eye is good insofar as it sees well. I think the classical theist can reverse this and say that functions are derivative of goodness, right? And really functions are piggybacking on kinds, right? But kinds are ultimately the product of goodness. Things can only be a possible kind if they somehow resemble goodness, right? So we see like the classical theist is pushing goodness way, way, way back, as far back as you can get it, and then it's getting everything else from goodness, which is God, right? So like, I don't think it's controversial that the classical theist has a really powerful way of sort of going between the horns of Euthyphro here. Of course, one might object to all the metaphysics at work here. What I don't think is particularly controversial, I think should be very attractive, is that the metaphysics on the table of the classical theist is really, really useful for getting around not just Euthyphro worries, but also driving all the way through to helping to avoid worries that might attend to traditional natural law or Aristotelian notions of goodness and so on and so forth. Sorry, I've rambled for a while, put a lot on the table. So let me pause there and get some of your thoughts and feedback.
Yeah, that's a lot of really good stuff. So maybe what we can do is step back and then come into it again. So I think you and I are agreed that what we see a lot of theologians and philosophers doing today, whether they're from the classical theist tradition or not, is they understand that the way to split the horns of the Euthyphro dilemma, so that morality isn't completely arbitrary on the one hand, and it's not something that exists as a standard outside of God. They clearly see that to split the horns, somehow God himself has to be the standard of goodness. Somehow God himself has, in God's very essence, his very being, he has to be the moral good, or he has to be the standard for the moral good, because we could argue whether or not God is morally good, but that's a question for another time. But just saying, as you said before, philosophers, theologians, we can say whatever we want. The question is, do we have a metaphysics to back it up? So just saying that somehow God's nature is the standard of goodness, just saying that isn't enough, right? Yeah. Because we have to explain what that means. Because if we leave that statement just out there on its own without really getting into the metaphysics and unpacking what we mean by that, the skeptic can just come along and say, how does that solve the problem, right? How does the Euthyphro not just reappear at a higher level when it comes to God's nature, right? Because just saying that God is the standard of goodness, and if we unpack this in a way that doesn't, I would argue, and you would argue, doesn't rely on divine simplicity, the Euthyphro is going to come back to bite us again, right? Because what you actually need to split the horns of the Euthyphro dilemma, metaphysically speaking, what you actually need is to be able to identify the being of God with the good.
With the good.
Right?
I think that's right, yeah. And just to give an example of this, Wes Morrison once objected to Bill Craig on this, right? By just bringing in a variant of Euthyphro, right? Um, is God good because right, explanatory, he has all these good making features, or are they good making features because God has them, right?
That's right.
And I think for the complex theist, this is a darn problem, right? This is a really, right? Classical theist doesn't have that, right? Good making features are what they are because they are analogously species of the wider genus of the good, right? I say analogously because we don't hold that goodness is actually a genus, right? But it again, the solution that is available to the classical theist is to identify God with the good, precisely because not just divine simplicity, right? And I want to be clear here, like, you could hold to a weird form of divine simplicity if you're a nominalist, right? Because for a nominalist, everything is unstructured. It's divine. When we say divine simplicity, we really mean like that whole metaphysical tradition, right? And that whole metaphysical tradition is a tradition that thought long and hard about what the nature of goodness even is, right? And it's importing all those commitments alongside, yes, the model of God that affirms that whatever else is fundamental has to be absolutely simple, right? It can't be fundamental if it is derivative of components that are more basic than itself.
That's right.
I think that's just a conceptual truth.
It can't be derived. It can't be dependent in any way, because if it is derived, if it is dependent. If it is composed,
it's not fundamental, right? Yeah.
It's not fundamental. We need to keep looking for the fundamental reality. Our search should not have stopped with God. We need to go beyond God, to see what God himself relies on. So the key here, I think, Pat, is there can't be a distinction if we're going to avoid these Euthyphro type issues. There cannot be a distinction between God and God's goodness, right? We can't have a distinction, a real distinction. Yeah, obviously there can be a logical distinction, but there cannot be a real distinction between God and God's goodness, because the moment that happens, then we have to say that somehow God's goodness is derivative, it's built up, it's a property that God has, and then we have to confront the Euthyphro just at a higher level. Is this feature, is this property good because God has it, or does God have it because it's good? The first option makes this good property trivial and circular, right? And then the second option, again, makes it seem that God is dependent on it, because
is God good because he has it, right? Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So anyway, this is really clear. This is a really clarifying conversation. I think it's a conversation that needs to be had, because there are as I said before, there are so many theists, Christian theists especially, apologists, who know instinctively that they have to go in this direction, but they don't have the metaphysics to then back it up, and it becomes open to skeptical objections.
Yeah, I think that's right. And nobody's forcing you to go between the middle. All I'm trying to give is a nice theistic picture that I think allows you to do that, and I'm skeptical that there's an equally good one that allows you to do that. Somebody could just fall on the independence horn. I think there's a cost there, and I think it does make certain non-theistic theories of moral realism, I don't want to say more tenable, but competitive, let's say, right?
Yeah.
And I think there are, I can't name too many. I know there's definitely some out there who will just want to go on the other horn. I find that completely untenable. I couldn't ever countenance going the arbitrariness horn myself, but at the end of the day, people can, it's a big bullet to bite, but people bite big bullets all the time, I guess, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Pat, can you kind of back up for us a little bit? You mentioned how some of the ways we try to relate God to morality end up falling back on a kind of bruteness. Can you unpack that a little bit? You kind of said that in passing, and I think that's important as just as rhetorically. We want to make sure that when we're giving a metaphysical picture of something like the relation between God and morality, or when we're doing apologetics or whatever it is we're doing, theology, we want to make sure that the explanation that we give doesn't end up in a kind of bruteness. Yeah. Because rhetorically speaking, the atheist, the agnostic, the skeptic can just turn that around and do the same thing to the theist. Mm-hmm. So can you kind of unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so we've talked about this before in more detail, but I'll give the executive summary of one of the main reasons I'm attracted to classical theism, and it concerns ultimate intelligibility. You know, I'm personally concerned with acquiring, if possible, a worldview that can drive brute facts down to zero. And a brute fact is a fact that seems like it needs a further explanation, right? It's not itself completely intrinsically intelligible. Yet you can ask around all you want and you can think about it all day, but there's just no answer to be given. It's not a mysterious fact, right? It's not that we just haven't found the answer. A brute fact is a declaration that seems to require further explanation, but there is none. That's it. Bertrand Russell famously said this of the universe. Why does the universe exist? It's just there. That's all. Go have dinner. Stop asking questions, right? Yeah. I think that is... now, a number of philosophers think that everybody is stuck with brute facts, right? And then what you get into is this sort of brute facts arms race, right? Who's got the fewest brute facts? So, I don't think that's right. I think you can get brute facts down to zero, but you need a particular worldview to do it. Now, the nice thing about classical theism is I think it has, in conjunction with with divine simplicity, the resources to give an essentialist explanation of why God exists and has the characteristics he does. And that's where it's really relevant, because God is, of course, fundamental. So, like, all explanation is going to bottom out here. So the question is God brute? Well, for classical theists, and the most interesting question here about bruteness is the question of existence, right? There's other questions about willing and stuff like that, and that's more complicated. But concerning existence, I've complained before, it's not enough, and this is a kind of nice parallel to the goodness worry, to just say that God is a necessary being. We want to know how something could be necessary. Just saying that something is necessary doesn't immediately remove all mystery. If anything, it like if I said, here is a turtle, and this turtle exists necessarily, that doesn't help at all, right? Right. Like, if anything, like, I'm now more confused, right? Like not only is it amazing that this turtle exists, but you're telling me it cannot not exist. Like, that's incredible, right? So the thing is, if you're going to have, something bottom out in an autonomous fact rather than a brute fact, an autonomous fact is something that would carry its sort of explanation internally, such that if we could grasp it, maybe we can't, but if we could grasp it, it would nullify the question about, why it exists. Sort of like once you understand what a mountain is, the question, why does a mountain have valleys, is nullified once you understand what those things are, right? That's an essentialist explanation, we might say, right? So classical theists say that God just is his existence, right? It is his very nature to be, that God just exists. I don't even want to say God exists. I think that's grammatically and logically sloppy, because we're predicating something of God. That's wrong, right? I think to get this logically clear, we need the notion of a logically simple proposition of exists. And this can actually function like an analytic proposition. Since it has no internal structure, there could be no internal negation. So if it's true, it's going to be necessarily true, which I think is a really neat feature. But is it true? I don't think it gives you an ontological argument. I think you need like a cosmological argument or something to know whether it's true. Fortunately, I think we have those. So all this is to say that I think that if you're a classical theist, you have the resources to punctuate the hunt for ultimate explanations in a being that is just, its nature just is its to be. It just exists, right? And that this gives you an essentialist explanation that also makes sense of why God exists necessarily, right? Because there's no real distinction between what God is and the fact that he is, if you will.
Yeah.
If you make existence a part of God, or if you don't even think that existence is there's lots of assumptions here. If you don't even think existence is a first level property, right, you're not going to have this resource available to you, let alone concerns about, real distinction between essence and existence. So there's a whole metaphysics here. I don't want to make it seem like these moves just come cheap and easy. There's a whole program at work, but I think this program does that sort of work. This sort of work of getting us to an ultimate autonomous fact, where we can say, okay, I don't comprehend or fully apprehend God's essence, but this seems to be the right sort of theoretical entity that could bring brute facts down to zero where nothing else seems to be a good theoretical candidate, if that makes sense.
Excellent. Right? I mean, yeah, great.
Now, if you're a complex theist, I think you just don't have that resource. I think you can say God is necessary, but I don't think you can really make sense of God's necessary existence. Like people say, well, God is a perfect being, but again, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to mean it with your metaphysics, right?
That's right.
So classical theists have a metaphysics that makes sense of perfection. The traditional use of perfection just meant complete or thoroughly made, right? Mm-hmm. So God, as a being of just pure being or pure actuality, has no potential, right? There's nothing that could make God more God, right? He's purely actual. He is as thoroughly made as anything gets. But also because God is not really distinct from his existence, he has no bounding essence, right?
That's right.
And what that means is that God isn't like existence in a horse mode or existence in a knife mode, which can only ever exhibit a relative perfection according to a kind, right? Whereas classical theists have always had a metaphysics of perfection, of an unbounded or absolute
perfection.
Exactly, where we have these things that can only be limit case instances or purely positive properties. So I would say that if you want to go perfect being theism, I really only think classical theism can metaphysically sustain that at the end of the day. Otherwise, you're saying one thing, but you need to give a metaphysics that can actually build this out, or you're just going to slide back into a composite notion of God, which is going to have serious questions about why God has just the features he does, being bundled together in just the way that they are, without any further explanation as to why they attain. Is existence a part of that, or does existence even factor into it, depending on how you think of existence? I think these are real serious live metaphysical issues that complex theists do not have good answers to. And in fact, many complex theists are just happy to go along with the sort of, contemporary thought that everybody has brute facts anyway. So they just kind of accept it, and then they'll just say, well, I think I have less brute facts than the atheist.
It's Richard Swinburne.
Or I think I can explain more. And I want to say that's a game I don't even want to play at all, right?
And if there is a metaphysical explanation on the table that can reduce brute facts down to zero, and is internally coherent, and is supported by a whole range of demonstratia quia argumentation, seems to me that would be these are all things that would be in favor of that view of God. If there is something out there that can bring brute facts down to zero and say reality is intelligible through and through, I think that's it ought to be enormously attractive.
I'm with you. And not only that, but I think like if that's part of a metaphysical research program that also like does serious, descriptive and explanatory metaphysics in other areas, which I think it does, then fantastic. I mean, what we're working with here is like real traditional essentialism, which I think plays huge roles, theoretical and explanatory, especially in morality, right? I think and we haven't even gotten into that yet, but I think it's hugely useful for morality, for philosophy of mind, for epistemology, and then the notion of existence, a thick notion of existence, helps make sense of modes of being, helps make sense of the problems of the one and the many. So like this is a program that does tons of work, right?
It makes creation intelligible, goodness as diffusive.
Yeah, goodness is diffusive. It says things about axiology, philosophical anthropology, epistemology, all the way down the line, and then gives you a model of God that seems to be the only one that I've ever found. Thinking about this for a very long time, it seems to be truly explanatory, comprehensive. It can explain everything else while also being able to explain itself. Not cause itself, but explain itself. I mean, sign me up, right? I mean, there's objections and there's, as with any program, right? There's objection to like, how do we, problem of individualization with prime matter. They're there. I acknowledge that, right? But like those pale in comparison to the issues I have with competitive paradigms. So a lot
because
that we could discuss there, but I want to at least get it out there.
Yeah, the issues from where I sit, the problems with other forms of theism compared to classical theism is that whereas classical theism may have some issues to work out in terms of its implications, other forms of theism have problems right at the fundament, right at the foundation. There seems to be issues with other forms of classical theism because they run into things like bruteness and so forth. So anyway, to reel it back in, so we want a understanding of God. We want a metaphysics, if we can, that brings brute facts down to zero. Now, if we think about the Euthyphro dilemma, and because before you said maybe some theists will just want to bite the bullet, maybe they'll just want to grab onto one or the other of the horns. Mm-hmm. Well, I think bruteness results in either horn. If you grab onto either horn, I think you can make an argument that ultimately you're going to be left with some kind of bruteness when it comes to the explanation of the relation between God and morality. So, for example,
it's just where it shows up. I think that's right.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So if we go for divine voluntarism, where morality and the good is just ultimately dependent on divine fiat, on the commands of God, then we run into a kind of bruteness here, because this view doesn't seem to supply an ultimate explanation for morality, does it? Because there's still questions that are left unanswered. Like, why should we do what God says? Like, why is it a good thing to obey God, right? Yeah. Just because he's more powerful than us?
Yeah, you're going to have a seriously attenuated form of moral realism at best, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. So anyway, it seems like you're going to have lots of explanations, or you're going to have lots of questions that don't get answered and explained. And then if you grab the other horn of the Euthyphro and you say that somehow there's a standard of goodness to which God's will conforms, then it seems like when it comes to the existence and the being of that standard of goodness, and you try to explain it, you try to ground that thing, again, it seems like you're left with just a brute reality. It just exists. It's just there, right?
Yeah. And then the skeptic will be, I think, well within their rights to just want to cut out that sort of divine middleman altogether, right?
Right.
And a number do. I think one of the most interesting, and I say some things against it in my book, The Best Argument for God, but I think one of the most interesting, atheistic, meta-ethical proposals are broadly Platonic ones. But they do have brute facts, scattered all about. But if the theist has them scattered all about, they can just be like, hey, look, buddy, we all got this problem. So let's just compare it along other dimensions or something like that, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. It just becomes a game of, whose brute facts are better, right? Who has the least amount of brute facts, but at the end of the day...
it shifts to a question about like moral epistemology, like, oh, well, we have better access to the moral domain or something if we have God in the picture. And that is an interesting question, and I think it's one that classical theism deals with extremely well from a nature-based epistemology. But it's not, to me, the most interesting question, right? And at that point, if that's where you're making the debate, I think the theist is already kind of lost in a significant way, if that makes sense,
I agree. And then there's the problem where if you allow any bruteness into the world of being at all, you're going to be epistemologically screwed. I think. Yeah. I'm convinced.
Yeah, I mean that's right. I think that's right. And we've talked about this before. I think one of the issues with admitting to brute facts is itself a problem of constraint, right? Is that it seems that as soon as you let in that something can just be there for no rhyme or reason, you have no principled way to constrain that, particularly, exactly. Constraining it with your own belief formation and cognitive process. Exactly. It invites all sorts of spooky scenarios that I think are really serious in terms of inviting like catastrophic skepticism. Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, Pat. Well, this has been a deep conversation here. We've been going for about an hour now. So
yeah, can I say one more thing? Because I'd like to bring it back to the authority question, because we haven't really answered that, have we? Why does God have authority? And I think that the classical theist can give a very good story here, right? That doesn't just come down to the idea that God should push you around if you don't listen to what he says, right? And it ties into traditional sort of virtue ethics and natural law. For the classical theists, we mentioned traditional essentialism, that things are what they are in virtue of having a particular essence, right? So, we are the same kind of thing because we both have our really the same but numerically distinct human nature, right? Essence, right? Mm-hmm. And these, in some way, reflect and participate in the form of the good, right? I would say they're a very high reflection, actually, in the classical theistic paradigm. They're, arguably the sort of acme or concentration point of creation. The human person seems to be this sort of, this concentration point between the material and the spiritual, right? Between rocks and angels, right? It's a very kind of cool story there. But we are not our own end. We are oriented towards the good as such, and ultimately, if you're a Christian, to union with the good, to share in the life of God, if you will, right? So we have what's called the good of endowment, the good we have just in virtue of being the things we are and existing. But there's also the good of achievement, the good we've yet to attain, but can attain as long as we perfect certain powers and exercise them well, right? So there's all sorts of certain facts about human nature which spell out real goods, things that really do perfect us and cause us to participate more fully in the good. I think these are immediately obvious to us. It's good to know things. It's good to have friendships, to love, to respect the order of justice, and indeed to obey authority, right? Like this is just one of those things that metaphysically perfect us. Why? Because we need authorities. We need moral authorities. We need epistemic authorities because we're not radically independent. We are social, rational animals, and good authorities, right? When they're exercising the authority well, are there to help us along in our flourishing, right? Good, and this is obvious, right? Good parents, good medical institutions. These are authorities that should be their purpose, their function is to help us function, right? That's what it is. Now, if God is the form of the good, he is the highest authority, he is the source and end of our very existence, and we should obey God, not just because, I think this is partly explanatory of it, whatever God, commands, he commands in accord with his nature as the good, so it's going to be good, right? Everything acts according to its nature in the classical theistic paradigm, including God as the form of the good, right? But it is in some way always going to be directing us towards what we already always seek anyways by nature, which is our own flourishing or happiness, right? So I think natural law and this essentialist-based account of morality has some really good resources because it's just a matter of natural necessity that we all seek our own happiness and flourishing. So that's a categorical. And if we want to actually attain that, get the good of achievement, we should follow the dictates of our nature. And one of the dictates of our nature is that we should obey, legitimate authority, right? And of course, the highest authority there. So I think we get a nice story. I think we get a nice story that doesn't come down to just might making right, where we can make sense of all the different sorts of authorities and why we sort of intuitively recognize them as being legitimate. But also a good story about God and God's authority that does not just rely on God having the biggest metaphysical muscles in town, right? How's that?
That's great. So the classical picture allows us to give a good explanation of how moral truths are grounded in the nature of God, but also how moral obligations could also be grounded in that nature, insofar as created natures participate in God, and they come built in with their own kind of moral obligation when it comes to rational creatures. So
and so really importantly, it's not like we need God to transcribe everything. Like the natural law is written on the hearts, right? Like most
exactly.
So this is really not so much a question of moral epistemology, but grounding. Now some things could be commanded. Just because, and it would be good to obey them, even if there isn't like an immediately obvious reason. There's a broader global reason. What side of the road we drive on, right? Like we need to pick a side, right? So whether
some things are purely conventional,
it doesn't matter, right? But there's still legitimate grounding for that, in authorities and the fact that you need to organize society and stuff like that, right? So I want to say there is a place for direct divine commands as well, but most of our everyday moral life is stuff that we can know through, I want to say through our nature, right? Through human nature, what human nature is, and of course, there's an epistemology there too, right? I think we could have that discussion another time, but I think that a nature-based epistemology helps to do a lot of important work in moral epistemology. Go figure, right?
Yeah. Seems to accord well also with what Paul says in Romans chapter 2, where he says even the Gentiles who don't have the law of God, the written commands of God, still have a kind of law because they have the law of God written on their hearts or inscribed on their hearts. So there is something that is within us essentially that directs us to our own flourishing and directs us to the good that we have access to, whether or not we have access to the revealed commands of God. So I think it fits well. But again, natural law theory is a massive subject that we could riff on. We probably should in another time. But anyway, I hope people can get the feel for the progression here of how to think about the nature of God as it relates to, or how to think about God as it relates to morality. And when you think really hard about it, I think you're going to see that ultimately we're going to need a picture where God is identified with the good itself, and that is the best way to conceptualize this relationship. So Pat, great job. Appreciate you being here. Now, anytime. Before we go, if you want to tell us where people can find your work, where they can follow what you're up to.
Yeah, if you're interested in my thoughts about God, my book, The Best Argument for God, definitely, is making the case for classical theism. So maybe start there. And then I'm on Substack at the humbly named Journal of Absolute Truth. So try to get 1 or 2 musings up there per week. So yeah, there you go. An
excellent journal. I highly recommend it. In fact, one of Pat's essays was kind of the inspiration for this conversation. So, well, thanks, my friend. It's been a joy.
Thank you, brother.